Hello, everyone. My name is Bara Vaida. I am the beat leader on infectious diseases for AHCJ. Thanks for joining us today for one of our series of webinars we host on health topics in the news. Today's topic is lab safety and the origin story of COVID-19 and how that's put a spotlight on safety and oversight issues related to infectious disease research and biosafety at laboratories. And to help us put this topic into context and to offer some story ideas is today's speaker, Alison Young. She's a longtime investigative reporter. She's also a journalism professor at the University of Missouri School of Journalism. And Young's book, Pandora's Gamble, came out just a few months ago and is an incredible piece of investigative work, looking at both the history of accidents and leaks at biosafety labs and what we might infer, perhaps, about our understanding of where SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, may have come from. Early in the pandemic, there were questions about whether COVID-19 was the result of a bioweapon or a lab accident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or a zoonotic spillover event from illegal wildlife for sale at the Wuhan seafood market. Most of the debate and the evidence is still pointing towards the zoonotic spillover, but there remains a lot of questions about whether it could have been a lab leak. And some experts, including the U.S. intelligence, some in the U.S. intelligence community and congressional Republicans, I think this theory was too quickly dismissed. Because this debate has become so politicized, I think it's been really hard for many health journalists to know how to cover this, how much credence they should put into this, whether this is something at all they should be covering. So I'm really glad that Alison is here today to give us some context on how to think about the story, but it's also this bigger picture issue of biosafety at labs. And it's really important to understand the history of this. A lot of reporters I know are working in communities where there are biosafety labs. So I think this just really great piece of work, and what Alison has done can be really illustrative and illuminating for journalists in terms of how to cover this topic in their communities. So for this conversation, we're going to do more of a fireside kind of chat format where Alison and I we'll have maybe a 20-minute conversation, and we'll open up for questions for you in the audience. You can ask questions at any time by typing them in that Q&A section and not in the chat section. We'll be able to see them, and I'll direct them to Alison. So Alison, thank you so much for this deeply reported book. Let's just get right to the very controversial question. You start your book by saying lab accidents happen with shocking frequency, even at the world's best run labs. And so let's start there. There was news actually just yesterday. The U.S. has cut off funding to the Wuhan Virology Institute because of its failure to be transparent about safety. So do you think the COVID-19 pandemic started with a lab leak in Wuhan?
I wish I knew. I think that for those who express much certainty in this arena, I'd love to see what very specific, concrete, beyond sort of circumstantial or limited data sets they're looking at. I think it's very hard to know where this pandemic came from. But as you mentioned at the top, I mean, look, the default value for pandemics is that they jump from nature. What's pretty extraordinary is that there is a very plausible hypothesis that this pandemic could have come from a lab. And that goes to why reporting on biosafety and biosecurity is such an important public health issue for us to cover as journalists.
Actually, just to this question about, you like to know what evidence there is that there may have been a lab leak. Have you seen any evidence?
Evidence of
a lab leak.
Of a lab leak. So there is much debate out there, and a lot of it is pretty ugly and pretty hypercharged about what is the evidence. And there is a group of scientists who are quite prominent and quite vocal, who their talking points are, there is no evidence for a lab leak. And they will say there is overwhelming evidence for a natural spillover, or that there is dispositive evidence, was one of the terms once used, that this pandemic began with a jump that occurred at the Wuhan seafood market in Wuhan. One of the things I think that has been a challenge in journalism is looking closely at the underlying data. For the scientists who are saying that there's overwhelming data that this pandemic began at this seafood market, sometimes referred to as a wet market in Wuhan, one of the greatest challenges, and the WHO has talked about this as well, is that there is not access to the earliest case data. The case data that is out there, there are questions about whether it was confounded by the early case definition of being associated with this market, which may have been a super spreader event. It may also be where the leap occurred from wildlife. But there is debate out there among scientists as to whether or not those who are saying quite loudly that this market is where the pandemic began, that the evidence overwhelmingly points to it. And I would really encourage, and we can talk about this a bit more, as more data is coming out through some of these congressional hearings, through FOIA lawsuits, you're finding that some of the scientists who have been research partners of those who have been speaking loudest will come out and say, Ian Lipkin, for instance, at Columbia University, who has been a co-author on some of these papers, in the transcribed essentially depositions that he was subjected to by one of the congressional committees. He basically says, no, there's no dispositive evidence that the Wuhan market is the source of this pandemic, and that those who are saying that, who are some of his research partners, have gone too far.
Interesting. So how do you think reporters should be approaching this?
You know, I think this is a really, really difficult story for journalists to cover, because there are so many layers. You know, there is politics that has intertwined with this, but I think as journalists, we need to recognize that the politics is not just among the politicians. And where human beings are involved, there are interests at play. And we have to be on guard for those, for everyone. I mean, whether it is politicians who have certain axe to grind, or the culture war, or, you know, trying to sort of defend various policies, or whether, as some of the documents that have come out under FOIA lawsuits, there were very much concerns that if the lab accident hypothesis gained oxygen, it could impact, scientists were discussing behind the scenes, that it could impact US-China relations, which obviously is a huge market for science, scientific journals, as well as access to specimens, especially involving flu and coronaviruses. And that it also could affect the potential for greater regulation in this area. So there are a variety of interests at play, and I think all of us need to be really vigilant about, you know, that old adage that if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out, that applies to everybody in this story.
Skeptical.
Yes.
Right. So let's kind of moving towards your book. You know, in your book, you highlight some really surprising accidents and leaks. Fort Detrick, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I mean, that story that you talk about with the duct tape. University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, University of Wisconsin, to accidents that occurred in Russia that released anthrax spores, to flu outbreaks. I mean, so I think, you know, can you talk some more about what were some of the things that most surprised you in this reporting of this?
Sure.
In this book?
You know, I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would have a specialty of reporting on laboratory accidents. And I think one of the things that's important for people to know is that I'm not somebody who has come to the question of lab accidents or the questions of COVID's origins because of the pandemic. I started reporting on laboratory accidents 15 years ago at this point. I was the CDC beat reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I assumed, like most people, that these particular facilities were highly regulated, that everyone working in them followed procedures absolutely perfectly, that there were redundancies in their engineering, that things were perfectly maintained. And I started getting tips about problems in CDC's labs, everything from power outages in their brand new building that caused a loss of directional airflow. And it turned out their own engineers had warned that the building was not designed properly to prevent against these kinds of massive power outages and failures of backup generators. So these kinds of incidents, what has been surprising to me is it's been an eye-opening journey over 15 years of seeing how often these kinds of accidents happen, how incredibly difficult it is as a reporter who does this for a living to get information about these incidents because of the labs fighting against access, because of federal agencies who, by the way, also conduct their own research, have their own labs that have had serious accidents, not wanting to release information. And it's an area that I think it's surprising because these kinds of accidents happen just a lot. And I think it's a very fertile area for people to be reporting on.
And do you think it's just because humans make mistakes, and no matter how hard you try to build redundancy, just errors happen because that's being human?
Yeah, there are a couple of issues. I mean, one of the things that I go into in the book is the whole history of biosafety, which began, interestingly enough, in the U.S. bioweapons program at what was then called Camp Detrick. And there was a man by the name of Dr. Arnold Weedham, who is considered the father of modern biosafety. And what Dr. Weedham really found, and many of the core safety measures that are in place in high containment labs around the world today are procedures and equipment that essentially was developed during that period in the 1940s and 1950s and 60s. And that issue of human error is a constant. And it also is these highly technical buildings and airflow systems and autoclaves and you name it, they all have to be maintained by human beings. And there are sometimes financial pressures. And then the other issue is, one of the adages is, as we know in public health, is that sunlight is a great disinfectant. There is very little sunlight and very little transparency, and therefore very little public accountability in this arena. And so it is difficult for those who study biosafety and want to make these labs safer through looking at best practices and what kinds of events are occurring and share that information. There's no good data on it. But also from a public policy and from a community and scientific trust arena, there's very little access to information for the public to know how safe or unsafe are particular labs and how well is the oversight process that we're all relying on, how well is that operating?
I wanted to get to something that's maybe a little bit had been obscure, but I feel like is really important to understand, which is this thing called gain of function, which is just sounds like just this hugely wonky term, but I feel like is really important given all of what you're just talking about and concerns about whether this is enough in terms of regulation of that. Could you talk about what that gain of function means? And then there is the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity that's supposed to be kind of overseeing this, just the point you're talking about.
Yeah, so one of the challenges is this whole arena is incredibly fragmented. There are, depending on what kind of research is going on and with what pathogen or who is actually funding it, it's this cobbled together system that has huge gaps in it. And so on the question of gain of function research, that's obviously a term that most people hadn't really ever heard of unless you really focus on this arena until all of the debates between Rand Paul and Dr. Anthony Fauci and sort of the ugly back and forths that occurred. Part of the challenge is that this all began back around 2011, late 2011. There were experiments that were done by Yoshihiro Kawaoka at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's lab and another scientist in the Netherlands, where they had taken the H5N1 strain of avian influenza and had manipulated it in the lab to make it transmissible among ferrets in the air. And the reason that that's so important is that ferrets are the model for how a flu virus might behave in humans. And so this was potentially gain of function research. This was the poster child virus for gain of function research. that takes a pathogen and makes it more dangerous in a variety of ways than is found in nature.
So I recently wrote about a biosafety 4 lab that opened in Manhattan, Kansas. I know there's some concern in that community about that. I mean, how concerned do you think that community should be? And for reporters maybe who are Midwest reporters,
Yeah.
how would you advise them to think about how they might be covering what's happening at this lab?
Definitely. And you know, what's happening so there is the new National Bioagro or Agro-Bio, I always get it wrong, facility, which is going to be a biosafety level 4 facility that works with animal pathogens as well as some pathogens that also can affect humans. This particular facility has been especially controversial because it will be the home of U.S. research on foot and mouth disease, which is a potentially devastating agriculture pathogen. The U.S. has been free of foot and mouth disease for many, many decades, and on purpose kept all of the research offshore at Plum Island off the coast of New York, because if you end up if this pathogen gets out, it can shut down our trade in livestock, and you have to destroy all kinds of herds. There have been a number of devastating outbreaks, particularly in the UK, and one of them in particular is the poster child for lab accidents. It was at the Purebright lab in the UK, where it was a vaccine facility, and they were doing other kinds of research, but they had live virus, and ultimately that outbreak, which spread to farms many miles away, it appears it was from leaking drainage lines that got picked up on the wheels of trucks that tracked it to where these fields were. So there are many ways that these kinds of accidents can get out. Now, in terms of reporting on this particular lab that's in Manhattan, Kansas, there are a number of things I think that are worth looking at. History is always a good thing to take a close look at. There were multiple risk assessments of this particular lab. Anytime a new lab opens, there will be some sort of environmental risk assessment that is done. Those risk assessments were incredibly controversial with the lab in Manhattan, where essentially the national academies were brought in and did 2 separate reports, both of which criticized the government's assessments of the risk that were just, off base. And so it raises lots of questions about whether or not we're assessing the risk properly, because that issue of risk assessments has come up across multiple labs that I've looked at. So you can look at those kinds of records. There are going to be commissioning records. There are going to be a variety of those kinds of things to look at. And I think it's worth also looking at how have the operators of this lab that's coming into Manhattan, how well have their previous labs performed? So the Department of Homeland Security has been involved in building that lab, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture is going to be running it. And there's an opportunity to look at the history of how well they've operated their labs around the country.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's really hard is to figure out where a lot of these labs are. I did find a site called globalbiolabs.org, which looks like it keeps a pretty good track on them. There's maybe 24 of biosafety level 3 and 4 labs in the US. So again, what would you might recommend to, if I recommend anybody who's watching this, please go check out to see if there's a biosafety lab in your community. What advice would you have for those journalists? Where to start?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. So when I was with USA Today, we did a big project in 2015 called Biolabs in Your Backyard, where we identified more than 200 biosafety level 3 and biosafety level 4 labs across the United States. And if you search hard, search for the term Inside America's Secret Biolabs and my byline, you'll find the main bar of that story. And there's a link to a digital interactive where we created this very cool, you can go in and look up by your state, the BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs, most of them are BSL-3, that we were able to find in our USA Today network investigation for every state in the country. And we also put a bunch of their records, their safety records online. So it gives you a running start if you go to that. And I can email this information if you want to provide it to people who attended. But there are a couple of things that you can do to find these biosafety level 3 and 4 labs. And it's what we did in that USA Today project. One of the things is that you can go onto the NIH reporter website. So where you look up NIH grants, because the NIH is obviously one of the largest funders in the world of biomedical research. Type in the term BSL-3, biosafety level 3, high containment, and the name of your state. And you're going to be able to start identifying where grant applications have said they're going to use one of these facilities. That's one good way to find it. The other thing is just Google your state and Google that. Go to your major universities. You're going to find that these kinds of facilities are at major agencies like the CDC, but they're also at biodefense contractors. Battelle is an operator of these kinds of facilities. The U.S. military has facilities across the country, and also a lot of university labs, as well as some public health labs have BSL-3 facilities. The BSL-4s are far fewer around. Another place that you can get some sense as to the number of these facilities is through the Federal Select Agent Program. Part of the fragmented approach to these labs is that there's like no universal place where if you are going to work with infectious pathogens, there's no federal one-stop shop to be accredited or regulated in some way. But there is something called the Federal Select Agent Program. It is jointly operated by the CDC and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Most of the labs are regulated through CDC, and it sort of divides along whether you're primarily working with human or animal pathogens. The Federal Select Agent Program oversees about 200 labs across the country, a little bit less. And these are labs that work with so-called select agent pathogens. They're things that pose a significant threat to public health and or agriculture. Often there's a bioterrorism component of concern about bioterrorism, biodefense. And part of the challenge with that is that there are some FOIA exemptions over some of those records that make it somewhat difficult to get information. But one of the other things you can do once you identify your labs is you can use your state public records law. So if your university is doing biological research, and most of them are, you can request copies of their own internal biosafety committee minutes. You can get copies of any sort of internal inspection reports and incident reports. So that's a really good way, and we did a lot of that. The other great tip I would offer is that for those labs who are working with recombinant or synthetic nucleic acid molecule research, basically genetically manipulated organisms, you are able to get from both public and private labs. If they receive NIH funding, they have to share with you any incidents they report to the NIH because they've had an incident with one of these genetically altered pathogens. So that's another way that you can get information. And there's specific guidance in something called the NIH guidelines.
Gotcha. Thank you, Alison. So I want to open it up for questions. So if anybody has questions, please type that into the Q&A section in the chat section. So actually, our first question here is wondering about the pushback that you got from the University of Wisconsin about the way you characterize the incident in your book. You know, how do you strive to give these incidents proper proportion and fairness to the labs, and thinking about public fears about leaks?
Yeah, I'll tell you, the University of Wisconsin is a very interesting case. If you go, you have to search around and go onto their website to find their pushback. Would it surprise you to hear that they never sent any pushback to me or to USA Today, which ran the excerpt?
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of a telling detail, I would say. And if you actually compare what they put forth and saying, these are the facts that she didn't present, go tally it against what was reported. And you'll find that in fact, what they're they're essentially fessing up to is only because I included it in my story. So, and I've posted on my website all of the underlying documents. And also I approached them as well about their note and asked them why they didn't reach out to me or to USA Today, and they did not respond.
Interesting. Yeah, very telling. So we have another question here. At a time when the public's trust in science is so polarized and low, this journalist is sort of personally hesitant to report on things like lab leaks. So, you know, I understand that scientists need accountability just like other groups who report on, but this journalist doesn't want the reporting to get misinterpreted or a headline or quote grabbed and spread out of context. So any insights for navigating?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the challenges is there are a couple of issues at play here. I worry a bit that the term conspiracy theory has been weaponized in some ways. There are clearly lots and lots of conspiracy theories. We've all seen it in our reporting. There's all kinds of just crazy stuff that's out there. But just because some people are calling something a conspiracy theory loudly doesn't make it so. And I think we've got to sort of work a little bit harder to figure out whether there's some there or if it's just total bunk. We don't obviously want to give airtime to crazy stuff. Okay. I mean, we have a responsibility and we have many facts we can report on and we have to choose our stories. But I think we also need to be mindful that the credibility of science, the credibility of science journalists, the credibility of journalism in general is potentially harmed when we ignore stories that are out there. And, you know, for better or for worse, and I really do mean it, I have no idea and no opinion as to whether or not COVID-19 came from a lab. I do think it's plausible, but so do a lot of scientists, and so also do some of the, well, actually all of the U.S. intelligence community. Every single one of them, agencies consider it plausible. But 60%, something like 60% of Americans believe COVID-19 came from a lab. So if we're not addressing what are the facts on this particular question, we're doing a disservice and we're potentially harming our own credibility as journalists.
Well, then another question here, thinking about the places where these labs are located, is there a database or tracker showing the population breakdown of communities where these labs are located, or any data by race, ethnicity, age of the people who live around them?
That would be very cool. That would be, I think, an awesome project to do. You know, as Bara mentioned, there is this globalbiolabs.org website where they have started tracking on an international level. Essentially, their website is very similar. They kind of picked up off of some of the stuff that we did at USA Today several years ago. There's a need for that. But one of the things about proximity and these labs is, as we all learned, if there is and let me step back, the vast majority of pathogens don't necessarily have the ability to cause a pandemic. So, I mean, the ones we're most concerned about are those with pandemic potential. But there is the possibility of localized outbreaks or other kinds of issues around labs in particular. So it's one of the reasons why you want to be concerned about it on a local level. But we also need to keep in mind that we need to think about this issue globally, because for the right kind of pathogen that is transmissible, it can spread with the speed of air travel.
Is there a movement for labs to practice sustainability or go green? There's a question here. Any implementing sustainable or green practices in terms of the way labs are ensuring biosafety?
Interesting. I don't know about any sustainable or green practices on biosafety, except I will say that I was on a listserv. One of the listservs that is a pretty interesting one that you can join is the association. It used to be the American Association for Biosafety, ABSA.org. Someone was talking about basically their sewage treatment systems, and that it's more green to have some of these systems that do heat treatment as opposed to doing individualized chemical of pathogens at the benchtop because you're using higher concentrations. So that's a green practice, but there's not much that I've come across in my research, but I also wasn't looking for it.
Could we talk about, I mean, one of the great things about this book is it's almost a roadmap of how to use FOIA. I mean, you talk about how much you use FOIA to find out so much of the information that's in the book. Can you talk more about, how you used FOIA and to sort of how journalists can think about using FOIA?
Sure. I think I use public records laws all the time on multiple levels. And I think one of the things about getting information about lab safety breaches and lab accidents is that you need to not just see it as a one-stop shop. So I put in records requests at both the federal level and the state level. So let's say I'm looking at a university lab, and so I'll request from them their lab accident reports. I will request if they are regulated by the Federal Select Agent Program, I will also file a request with the CDC, if that's who their primary oversight organization is, for information from CDC. I will also look at, okay, because it's also fragmented, have they had any wastewater problems that are associated with their labs? So I might go to the state environmental agency because they may have information. So I'll look there. If they've had a lab accident, one of the key questions we need to be asking, and this came up a lot in Pandora's Gamble, is did they notify the local public health officials, local or state public health officials? If you're putting somebody on a fever watch or potentially quarantining somebody or making the decision that you don't need to quarantine someone who's been exposed to a potential pandemic pathogen, part of the system assumes that you're going to let local public health know because they're in the business of sort of helping advise on that. And what I found over and over is that when these incidents have occurred, often the labs have not, or they have significantly delayed letting local public health know. In the case of a very serious safety breach at USAMRIID at Fort Detrick, just north of Washington, D.C., that lab released 2,000 to 3,000 gallons of unsterilized lab waste into, shot over a containment wall into an area with an open manhole and went into a public waterway that flows through downtown Frederick, Maryland. And their public health director of the county health department told me for the book that when she finally was told about this, she asked for more testing along Carroll Creek. She was very concerned, but they wouldn't do it. USAMRIID wouldn't do it. And she did not have the resources or the expertise in her department to do this. So the question of, the ability of public health to actually be a partner or to really help protect the public when these labs are in their communities, I think that that's a really ripe area for reporting.
Yeah, first thing you should do is file a FOIA report, it sounds like, if you find out there's a safety lab in your community. Here's a question of what would a lab accident look like in a 911 call in an emergency? So like if you were trying to figure that out, what would that look like, do you think?
So, it can be a variety of things. You can get 911 calls. When the CDC had a number of these power outages, there were various sort of reports that would come out that way. Most of the time, there would not probably be a 911 call unless somebody is seriously injured or they're calling an ambulance or whatever. The normal reporting process if there's a lab accident. So the kinds of things that often happen are, you might have somebody drop something that's infectious, or it might splash on them, or they have an airflow system. It's supposed to be negative airflow flowing from clean areas into the contaminated areas, that maybe they have a reversal of airflow and it flows outward into an area that's a clean corridor where people aren't wearing PPE. But those are these things that are not like this very obvious kind of event. And so what normally happens is there's a report to the internal lab biosafety office, and they may go through employee health, and only if it's a select agent is it going to probably get reported to the CDC. And even then, that's kind of secret unless you really sort of fight to get the information. If it's an NIH regulated manipulated organism, and that's not even regulation, it's more about a condition of their federal funding, there will be a report that goes to them. But this is probably not something you're going to find through 911 calls unless it's a fire or some sort of generalized emergency.
And then could you talk about just the process of writing a book like this? I know it was 15 years of reporting, but as pulling off an investigative project, how did you do that?
Yeah, this was a really fast turnaround of a book, even though I have 15 years of experience, and a lot of that is part of the book. I did a lot of brand new reporting that breaks tons of news about all kinds of accidents in this particular book. And basically from the time that I found a publisher who was interested in the book to when I had to turn it in was not quite a year. It was about 10 months is all I had to basically largely report and write. And then it came out in April. And this was in part, we did this because this is such a timely issue. And I felt it was really important that there be this context to the larger questions. You have to be incredibly disciplined when doing a book like this. I work really hard. I work really long hours. I have never worked so many hours in my whole life. We're talking 7 days a week, getting up sometimes at 4:30, usually by 5 in the morning, often working incredibly late. But it's also one of the most rewarding things to do, to have an opportunity to really explain in depth a really important topic.
And then you were talking a little bit earlier about just sort of the way the book publishing industry works these days, and that one of the ways to get the message out that there's this book is the podcasting side of things. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how do you get your book out there?
Yeah. So, it is sort of, there are a lot of things to learn when going into the book world. And there are probably many people on this webinar who know more about book publishing than I do after only one book. But when you go the book route, you are sort of responsible for a lot of things, not only just reporting and writing, but it's creating the excerpts and finding the people to run your excerpts, and then also doing promotions. One of the things that I ended up doing is I ended up hiring my own publicist for a couple of months. And so that has been tremendously helpful. The folks I'm working with at Nardi Media have been excellent at sort of directing me. They work with a lot of authors in doing podcast placements. Apparently, podcasting is an important place to get out when you're talking about books, because those who listen to podcasts have an affinity with the podcast and the host, and that also helps them understand that you're a credible voice when you're talking about your book.
And then just kind of back to, in general, thinking about all that from all you've learned over these years, what keeps you up at night in terms of, are you continuing to cover this topic?
I'm like a dog who won't drop a bone. I started on this 15 years ago. I will be continuing to report on it. I have ongoing FOIA requests out. I just think it's such an important area, and I think it's one that a lot more reporters ought to cover. The public is very interested in this issue, and I think that all of us could do a wonderful public service if we started reporting on labs and how well their safety is and is not working, what kinds of technology they've got in place, what kinds of policies are currently being debated in this arena. And as far as what keeps me up at night, if you go back and take a look, if you go to the GAO's website and search for the term high containment lab, you will see that there have been reports issued by the nonpartisan GAO going back more than a decade that have warned that we do not have the kinds of oversight structures in place, that the federal government doesn't even know where all the high containment labs are, and that without better oversight in this area, that we're at risk, that the proliferation of these kinds of labs is putting us at risk of a catastrophic lab accident. And that is the thing that keeps me up at night. one of the arguments you hear in the lab leak debate is that, oh my gosh, I mean, it's so rare to have anything. And there have been incidents. I mean, the 1977 flu there is plenty of support that was some sort of a lab or research or vaccine trial related accident that released a strain of influenza that had appeared almost frozen in time. Our technology is changing rapidly in how we are manipulating pathogens. And the lab building boom that began after the anthrax attacks in 9/11 is now accelerating because of COVID-19 as countries all around the world, some of whom have no history of working with high containment facilities that cost an extraordinary amount of money to maintain once you even build them. The GAO's warnings have been clear. The more of these labs that we have and the more research that's being done, the risk is going up.
So in many ways, we've been lucky over all these decades.
I think that the thing that, as I went through and wrote about all of these case studies in Pandora's Gamble, what you find is that over and over, we have gotten lucky. Most of the time when these lab accidents occur, nobody gets sick. And, most of the time, if someone does get sick, it is just confined to the researcher. But then in some cases, it extends beyond to their families and sometimes beyond that. And so, yes, it's rare that we have these serious and widespread outbreaks that are associated with a lab facility. But we also now have the trend line of so many more labs doing so much more research with potential pandemic pathogens. And, what exactly is that increased risk? I think that's hard to calculate, but it's the experts say it's going up.
So we're almost out of time. If anyone has any more questions I'd like to put in the Q&A, please do that. So I wanted to ask you, kind of close with, what's your next big investigative project? What are you working on now? And how are you?
I am still working on, there are several pieces that I am working on that relate to biosafety and biosecurity. And so I see that as being something that I'm going to be focusing on still for probably in a pretty focused sense, probably for much of this year. And then I don't know what's next.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to more stories from you, and we'll be paying close attention. I want to thank you so very much for being here today, Alison, and putting this story into context. And recording will be available of this webinar in the next couple of hours, likely. So please feel free to watch this again and let others know about this. And I hope that this has been helpful for everyone out there who's been watching this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.